Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. I'm David Edgar. I'm a corporate partner with the global law firm K&L Gates. And today we actually have a couple surprises. This is live. And one, we had Philip originally was going to be joining us, but he's not feeling well. And so Gabby and I were going to do this ourselves, which I think would have been fun. But one of our partners, also from our UK office, Jen Marsh, graciously agreed to jump in. And so we now have a full house of super talented people from our UK office. And also, as we were getting ready, Gabby had a fire alarm in our office in London. Nothing, no emergency, but it's been going off. So, Gabby, I don't know if it is off or on, but you can let us know that you're safe. And
I'm fine. It
okay,
was a test.
okay, good. So
I
that was
escaped
going off.
unscathed.
Yeah, that was going off. So no, Gabby, thanks for doing this, and Jen, thank you especially because you had zero preparation, zero thinking that you were going to be doing this today. So I know I'm super happy that you could join in also.
No, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I've been, as Gabby knows, I've been posting maybe too much on cross-border deals and what was happening in 2022, and then as we're moving into 2023, I've even posting a little bit more about it, um, and the posts have been all over the place. And on some of them, I've been talking about how cross-border deals, and I usually think about into the U.S. or out of the U.S. But really, globally, I think the trends are very much the same, and you're seeing just incredible headwinds in variety of ways that are affecting, M&A deals that we're all seeing in our practices. Um, and we know what those are, so I won't list all of them, but it's things like, geopolitical instability, which has some impact on what we'll be talking about today in terms of the foreign direct investment rules. But it's also, interest rates and supply chain issues and all kinds of macroeconomic factors. And then you have all the individual country specific factors that are impacting what's happening with deal flow and cross-border deals. This morning, I posted a little bit about currency movements too. We're seeing some retrenchment of the dollar against the pound I saw and euro, but in general, the dollar's been very strong. And I think if U.S. buyers are able to sort of get some visibility into some of these other factors that are, creating some uncertainty that deal makers just can't stand, um, we'll probably see more cross-border from the U.S. into the U.K., into Europe and other parts of the world, and that currency advantage should give some tailwind to U.S. buyers. So it's a mixed bag of things that are out there. But Gabby, one of the things that we were talking about, and I think why we wanted to do this is the foreign direct investment rules, which we've had in the U.S. through CFIUS for a while, and they were tightened up even maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago. They've been there. So for foreign buyers coming into the U.S., they've gotten used to that regulatory regime, and it's kind of molded into the merger control analysis and everything else. But I think I've been surprised, I guess, in the last few years, what we've been seeing in the foreign direct investment rules, around the globe, and particularly where you and Jen are in the UK. So maybe, I guess, to kind of start us off at the beginning, maybe Gabby, give us a little flavor if you agree with that sort of characterization of what you've seen, if that's consistent with your view, and then what's been happening in Europe and particularly in the UK, when you're thinking about foreign direct investment. I guess I should start with, what does that mean? And for people who aren't thinking about that, it's really pretty broad, and it can involve any time you're making any kind of an investment in a company or having contractual relationships. It's a very broad definition, so maybe we'll cover that. So Gabby, give us your sense of where you see things now in 2023, and maybe a little history. I know we have a couple slides, so whenever you want those, I can I can pop those up also for you.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for having us. It's great to be on here. It's definitely my first LinkedIn Live. I didn't know about LinkedIn Live until I saw your series. But you set the right scene, because there's been a massive acceleration in the last couple of years of foreign investment rules. And actually, it's come as a big surprise for us lawyers who practice the law as well. You'll find that in Europe, most of us traditionally were antitrust lawyers or competition lawyers, which we continue to be. But we adopted foreign investment as a secondary practice area because it arrived so quickly. It's quite unusual still to see a whole separate foreign direct investment team in a European law firm or European offices of US law firms, unlike in the States, where you have CFIUS-specific lawyers who are quite distinct from antitrust lawyers. So it's quite interesting as well to contrast the processes, which we can talk through about how we're dealing with it on the regulatory side, dealing with two different regimes. But why are we here? Well, there's been a whole lot happening in the last couple of years that highlighted to countries that they didn't have tools to deal with investments that made them feel uncomfortable. And rewinding in Europe specifically, post-global financial crisis, Europe and, lots of parts of the world were suffering. There was a liquidity issue, and they were all too happy to have foreign investment, and be rescued by the likes of Chinese buyers and so on, and Russian buyers. And it was very much invited. And then I think the tide started to turn, say 2015, 16. Suddenly you had a couple of deals where it felt a bit too close to home, where you had, say, certain technologies or robotic transactions being acquired by foreign investors, and then the countries felt that it wasn't something that they had really thought about yet or got to grips with, and they didn't have the legal tools to stop that, like CFIUS. Sometimes they try to squeeze it into merger control, but it's an uncomfortable fit. It's not always possible. And so that led to this new European directive being passed, where the European Commission essentially recommended to the European countries to put in place foreign investment regimes. They didn't have to do that. Most of them have or are about to implement them now. They could choose what shape and size, so they actually look very different depending on the policies. But the idea was to have this cooperation between European countries to keep an eye on who was acquiring critical assets, because there'd always been something in the traditional sectors, defense and so on, but less so in some others that were becoming strategically important. And then, very quickly I can touch on some COVID happened, and supply chains went crazy, and then suddenly you had PPE shortages. Who has masks and vaccines? So suddenly there's this very protectionist attitude to holding on to those things. And then you have the likes of you have the war in Ukraine, and an energy crisis, energy security, and then technology. And so I think one of the things we can discuss later on as well is how technologies that feel quite benign to us, or that we think of as quite fun, the likes of the TikToks of the world, or the dating apps and so on, are not perceived by the governments like we see them. They see them as potential security threats. So I've got some slides that we can pull up in a bit.
I'll show you those.
These are just a couple of headlines of illustrating this shift in attitude, where Europe invited all this spending and investment. That was a headline in the FT early 2015. And Europe will welcome the continued strength of Chinese investment. And then fast forward to a couple of years later, and then EU moves to protect interests. And the narrative has completely shifted. So that shows, and it was driven by a couple of countries, France, Germany, and some others, but that really pushed for the regulation, which is now widespread. You'll find that some countries are still very inviting of investment because it fits with their growth objectives, but for the most part, you have quite strict rules now requiring these mandatory reviews of a lot of deals. Then COVID, supply chains. Some of these are quite recent headlines from last year. If you could skip forward, then this is Russia had a massive impact. I mean, we live in London, and a ton of the beautiful buildings are now under sanction rules because of the ownership. So this just illustrates how it can shift from one day to the next. So it's really fast moving, and the countries have had to grapple with keeping the regimes broad enough that they encompass these potential dynamics that might shift politically, but at the same time don't turn off investors that they find favorable at the time. And I think I have maybe one or two more. And so these are, Jen always laughs at me when I pull up some of the racier ones, but dating apps like Grindr could pose a national security risk. And then, TikTok, Bumble, Tinder, because the way that they are seeing it is holds onto or has access to all this information, personal information about people's interests, where they live. Also, they found in Australia that some of these apps are being used to identify possible spies, because you can see who's lonely. So it's just seeing it through a different lens, which is quite interesting.
It also shows the broadness of, that they're not. It's not just as you say, sort of, the obvious semiconductors or defense. There's certain critical type industries that you anticipate having that, but this shows that it's everything from personal data to access to networks to all kinds of other things that are raising it. But it's super interesting, though, Gabby, that you talked about that, because there was a push, as you said, sort of in the 2000 after the sort of the Great Recession 8-9, where especially in Europe, there was a real push to get more, foreign direct investment coming in, and that was very strongly encouraged. And then, as a result of a variety of economic, factors, and most particularly COVID, probably, it's almost just completely, reversed. And so you've now got this very protectionist thing.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you mentioned that, Jen, maybe I'm curious your thoughts. We talked about that briefly before we got on. Gabby was saying there's sort of an interrelationship between what people are familiar with in the merger control environment, whether a transaction has anti-competitive impacts versus the foreign direct investment component. And I think it was my thought that, in the early days of COVID, or when this shift was happening that Gabby talked about, you had some people kind of arguing for, using the merger control statutes as a way of impacting policy consideration, or, controlling these national security interests. Did you get that sense as well? Is that a reason why maybe these stronger FDI rules have come into play as a way of, I guess, filling a bit of that gap and closing some of the, the loopholes that you really couldn't, address just by using, merger control type provisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely it. And I think there's a discomfort with using the merger control rules for political ends. I mean, certainly even now, it's not intended to be seen as in European regimes, they're generally not trying to protect jobs and so on. That's not seen as a legitimate goal of the FDI rules. It's about, maybe we did have the tools to stop Russia acquiring, a defense contractor that builds tanks, or, that builds fighter jets. But we didn't have the tools. I mean, David, you say semiconductors is an obvious one. We didn't have the tools to review that kind of transaction for foreign investment issues before the 2021 National Security and Investment Act here. So yeah, I mean, I think we absolutely need to factor that in, and it should. I think a lot of deal makers are now familiar with sort of international merger control. That it's not just HSR, but that there's a lot of unavoidable regulatory hurdles to go through internationally on the merger control side, and you're going to have to delay completion, and until you've gone through those hoops in a lot of cases, and you have to plan for them and think about it early. And I would say it's now sort of just the same on the foreign investment side. It's not just CFIUS, or if you're familiar with the Australian regime, that's also been in place for a long time, the Foreign Investment Review Board handling filings there. But the European regimes are really just dramatically broader, as Gabby was saying, in the number of sectors they cover, in the how low the thresholds are to trigger filings, the types of turnover that you need to see generated locally to trigger merger filings in many instances. They're not here for foreign investment. It's got a much more kind of look and feel type test about it. But again, that there are sort of things you can trip up on, I would say. I mean, we talk about foreign investment post the global recession, good and now bad. Well, obviously not. We still want to encourage plenty of foreign investment in UK in particular. Everyone's very keen in government, I think, to make it clear that UK is open for business post Brexit. Definitely still want to see more investment from friendly economies, and you see that a lot in the way they talk about the new regime in any announcements they put out. But on the other hand, this new regime actually applies to all investors. It can be even a UK company acquiring another UK company, and that's not relevant to whether you have a filing and have to wait for your deal to be cleared. It in terms of the actual trigger for the filing, it's the same as if it was a Chinese acquirer. It's just that we might well flag a Chinese acquirer with a slightly different risk assessment for the outcome of that review and how long it's going to take.
Well, let me pick up the story where Gabby, where you were, and I'll pop the slides back up because you can see a little bit of where let me see if I can do it here, where the FDI regimes sort of have expanded. Now, that's not a before and after, but you can get a flavor of that, and maybe you could sort of give us a thought of where you're seeing particularly stronger regimes and just maybe a little overview on Europe and UK.
Sure. So the one observation I'd make first is that Jen picked up on a good point about in some countries you don't need to have a foreign investor. And in fact, the term foreign direct investment is actually a bit dated now. It's used, but it's a misnomer. It doesn't have to be foreign and it doesn't have to be direct. It just has to be an investment in a certain sector. You have, in fact, a lot of the investments that they get concerned about are indirect, which is, we can talk about some of the practicalities of what you need to submit when you do a filing, but it's these very complex structure charts that go all the way to the ultimate controller. And so that's often indirect investment. So what is this map showing us? I think it's often surprising to deal parties and corporate colleagues and deal makers that there are so many regimes across the world. And in fact, there are some, these are increasing daily. There are a couple on the horizon. The European map you can see is almost full. In fact, this one reflects the position that's ongoing and about to be almost crystallized, because, for instance, the Irish regime is about to come on board. So for all intents and purposes, we see that as applying equally. Netherlands, because some of these regimes have retroactive effect. They can look at deals that happened in the last couple of months. But what's interesting here is that each one has its own flavor, even within Europe. But some of these the majority will be mandatory, meaning that you have to, if you meet the requirements of the act, so the target is active in a particular sector or has certain kinds of customers, then you are most likely to have to file a notification and get approval. But then there are a handful that are still voluntary or voluntary in some situations. So in Europe, Portugal's a good example of voluntary. Canada is voluntary in some situations. There's a bit of a risk assessment to be done there, and there is mandatory to be pre-closing or post-closing, depending on the situation. And sometimes some regimes are very narrow in terms of what really bothers them. So some of these regimes, particularly say in some in South America, India, they're more concerned about investment and foreign investment in certain industries because they want to retain local ownership in those industries. So they're more protectionist type regimes as opposed to national security focused. Whereas the newer regimes tend to be focused more on really understanding who is acquiring and owning assets and companies that are of strategic and critical importance to a country. Other factors, timelines differ. Some are quite short. In fact, most will, if it's an uncontroversial deal, and the vast majority of deals will be unproblematic, and so that's something to take as reassurance that it's unfortunately it's another thing to add to the deal timetable, but it's not necessarily concerning, and you just have to make sure that you do it quickly enough that it doesn't impact your timing. Most deals are going to be fine, but we can flag a couple that have very lengthy timelines. So Germany, for instance, in certain sectors can have a very long time frame of up to 10 months. That being said, if it affects, for instance, defense and certain industries, but most filings will go through very quickly. And Spain is an interesting example where they used to have an informal clearance mechanism, but that was very quick. But now there isn't any sort of phase one stage, and the filings seem to have slowed down somewhat. So there's a real risk that an unproblematic deal could end up in a 4-month review period. So these are the sorts of nuances that it's worth getting to grips with the local regime and whether the deal is actually caught within the regime. In Spain, for instance, they don't have thresholds, but they have qualitative thresholds. Does it really have an impact on the public order and so on? So really understanding the test and really understanding the current timelines so that you can structure the deal as well as possible.
Well, it seems to me that it is very complicated. And Jen, is it still the case that in the EU, I guess one benefit from the merger control side was you can do sort of a coordinated, right, EU merger control filing. The UK would be obviously separate if that's triggered as well, but you have sort of that one combined. But I thought my recollection was on the FDI side, although there are sort of a coordination in the EU, it's still kind of a country by country, as we saw in the map. Is that right? So that if you have a target that has operations or employees or significant assets in I don't know 9 member states, you may need to do an EU merger control filing, which hopefully would be one coordinated, but then you could have multiple individual member state FDI filings, perhaps with different triggers or different sort of sensitivities. Is that fair as to how you would approach it if under that set of facts?
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent summary, David. So yeah, we often talked. Anybody who's done a deal in Europe might have had the phrase "one-stop shop." Brussels, the European Commission in Brussels, would often do for a reasonably large transaction, would often do the only review for all of Europe, and it would be a merger control review, and that would mean that no other member state could do their own merger review. They couldn't try and apply our anti-competitive agreements rules to say that this joint venture has effects in terms of the cooperation of the parents. That it was all had to be in Brussels, and that was a sort of key principle. One thing now, yes, is Brexit, so the one-stop shop doesn't apply to us, and you need to consider UK merger control separately. And the second thing is absolutely FDI. You could have multiple FDI filings around the different member states. And as you say, David, there is the element of coordination, which if you have some EU FDI filings, then I would say that increases your risk for other jurisdictions as well. So if you're perhaps, a lot of these regimes are relatively new because of the reasons Gabby was talking about, and if you're looking to sort of, we might be one side of the line, we might be the other. If you are making EU filings in another member state, in another EU member state, then there's less scope to sort of take a view, and you're probably going to need to be more conservative in your assessment in the remaining member states. So yeah, I mean, it's a big regulatory burden for large transactions at present.
One of the interesting features there is if you make one filing in Europe, the member state is technically obliged to notify the European Commission, which then puts it out for comment to the other member states. And then you have to await feedback, basically their commentary on, and the European Commission's comments on the deal. And this hasn't really been a major problem so far, but it does impact on it's not like companies can, fly under the radar by just, as they might possibly be able to do to some extent in merger control, where they take a view. I mean, no, it's very unusual for someone to take a view on merger control in Europe, but if they were considering doing that, it's much harder on FDI. And the other thing is, from a timing perspective, technically a deal cannot close until you've received those comments. So it's a timetable point to be factored in. One of the positive things we're seeing is that some countries are starting to be quite pragmatic about this, quite commercial about, I know, for instance, Germany, I think it only notifies the European Commission when, it's really looking into a transaction that is more interesting, so that it's not flooding the European Commission with unimportant filings. But as Jennifer said, the systems are still maturing. Germany's had something like this for some time. It's just expanded, so it's a bit more well-trodden in terms of the expertise, but a lot of the newer regimes are still figuring this all out. And so there is an element of, when putting in one of these filings, there is very little scope for advocacy in FDI, unlike in merger control, but there is an element of anticipating questions that others might have, so that you bat those off early rather than waste time having to deal with questions later.
Well, I think, and for people listening, you can make comments too, by the way. So if you do have, questions for us, drop them in, and I'll try to, monitor if any do come up. It's a very complicated and in some ways sort of overwhelming thing to think about, especially if you don't do a lot of, cross-border deals. But if you're thinking about, getting into that, or you're, planning on doing one that, triggers these multiple jurisdictions, from the deal side of things, to me, this just again shows, one, why you need, a place like we're at KNL, because, we have the capacity in all of these different countries to sort of address it. And in my experience on the US side, the team is really awesome. And in most of these, major countries that that we're talking about. But beyond that, it's the preparation and thought that goes around it. And for me, I've now had drilled in my head, Jen, from you, Gabby, over on deals we've worked on over the years, you have to be thinking about this immediately. Whether you undertake the full diligence or not, right away, you have to weigh that. But as an initial matter, I like to get a feel almost from, before you're even thinking about the deal. You're just sort of at the early stages, just to get a flavor, what are we talking about? Where might there be issues that we have to address? What kind of timing, might there be? Gabby, as you talked about, it can really range, and also start thinking about, how do we allocate those risks? Because the buyers and sellers may have completely different, perspectives, and we'll touch on that, especially in these voluntary places where, a buyer may have a completely different view as to, whether or not to make a voluntary filing or not, than a seller, who often will say, hey, I just want to get this thing closed. We don't have to make a public announcement. Let's try to just get this wrapped up as quickly as we can. And those tensions, you do see in, in deals as you're working them through. But that preparation, and it's also sell side and buy side. So it can impact on the sell side, who your scope and universe of buyers might be. There might be a preferred, buyer set of buyers, but they may be from, China, or from areas where you're going to have much higher scrutiny. And maybe it's not a bad idea to get some political expertise, whether it's like a political lobbying type people like we have in the US or elsewhere, where you can get a feel of what the political, dimensions might be, because deals are becoming more public in that way, and those kind of considerations are there. But maybe you can even do from the sell side some planning. Maybe you divest some things before a major sale. Maybe you think about it over a period of years, and maybe there are ways that you can structure or plan your operations so that you don't so that you make a subsequent sale easier or allow for more potential buyers. So I'm thinking about all those things as you're both describing it, but I can just imagine people listening thinking, wow, this is a lot of stuff. And it is, if you're doing a deal that involves a lot of different countries. But I want to drill down now on our favorite country, which you happen to be in, which is the UK, because let's look at those. And merger control, Jen's now on, and Gabby, you still do that. But let's look a little bit at the merger control and FDI specific to the UK, and maybe give us a little sense. Gabby, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the new FDI rules, how are you seeing those shape up in terms of process, and whether deals are being heavily scrutinized, blocked, what you're sensing now that you've had a couple years, I guess, right, with that new, with the new regime in place.
Yes, that's right. So I'm just looking at the date now. It came into effect. Was it last January, or have we been doing it? Yes, it was. It's been a year. It feels a bit longer than that, but it was the 4th of January last year. We had been doing it sort of informally, and that's why I was just thinking it felt like longer than that. It's because until it formally came into effect, we were liaising with the ministry, which is called it's recently rebranded as the Department for Trade and Business. Did I get that right?
Business and Trade. But
Business and Trade.
If you get the UK Prime Minister right, then you're keeping ahead of the curve of presidency.
Until very recently, we call it had a different department name. But a new law was implemented called the National Security and Investment Act, and it introduced for the first time in British legislative history a mandatory deal clearance regime, because a lot of the M&A lawyers and deal parties who might be watching will be familiar with the fact that in England and in the UK, merger control is voluntary. I always think of it as sort of quasi-mandatory, because some deals are just very high risk, so they will necessarily have to go through, and or go through a review process, and it's harder for the buyer in those situations to try and secure conditionality, because the seller always knows that it's voluntary, so it's up to you to file. Whereas now in the UK, we have this mandatory regime that is triggered when a target is active in one of 16 or 17 mandatory sectors. And they range from the traditional, such as defense and media pluralism. In fact, both of us have been involved in transactions that were dealt with under the old regime, where in the context of a merger control review, the ministry or the relevant ministry could intervene and look at the transaction from the perspective of the national interest. But those were very narrow. They were very, very rare. They were massive deals that also had competition issues, antitrust issues. Now you have a situation where you don't need to have any overlaps. You don't even have to have revenues, and a transaction can be looked at depending on the activities of the target. And within those 17 sectors, those are the higher risk ones. But outside of those, in closely related sectors, the government retains the right to look at the deal. Now, that's all quite scary, and I can see how in the context of all these countries in the map and everything is covered, how it could be quite bewildering for a deal party. But I think that on the plus side, I would say that it's actually very streamlined in practice. The majority of deals are not going to be problematic. In the UK, the majority of deals are going through very quickly. There's an informal phase 1 process of 30 working days. After that, the government can decide to what they call in a transaction for more detailed review, and the majority get cleared within the first 30 days. And in fact, sometimes a little bit before that. And also it's an online form. There've been some teething issues with the form, but most lawyers who deal with this are now quite efficient at this. It's become, I'd say, across most of these regimes, there's been a real maturity of and efficiency in the process on the deal side. And so those are pluses and lots of tips and tricks to accelerate and to shorten the preparation timetable. Do you have anything else to add, Jen, from the UK experience so far?
No, I mean, I definitely agree with all of that. I think it was when the regime was announced, people were saying, oh my God, I mean, what we had 20 reviews under the old public interest regime, which was, sort of classic defense issues and so on. And the prediction was, I think the government's own prediction was 1,800 filings a year. So that's, a real sea change for people, and moving to a mandatory regime, as Gabby was saying. I think actually the initial indications are that the government was roughly right in the number of filings, although people might say that deal activity has been a bit suppressed, post-COVID, or some of the issues David was talking about. Maybe there's also some missed filings still at this stage because of a lack of awareness of the regime. But in any case, I mean, basically, I would say the ISU within the Department of Business and Trade is handling filings efficiently, and the regime is broadly working as intended. And there does seem to be, even though the definition of when do you have a national security issue is delightfully vague for the government, so that there's a lot of discretion there. I think we as practitioners are starting to find it a bit more predictable as to when we're going to get further questions, or when there's going to be a big issue.
Do you get clearance, Jen, right after? So let's say you're a buyer. Are you seeing then that? And let's assume there's no merger control, filing with the CMA in the UK. So if you just have an FDI filing, are buyers then just putting in sort of a closing condition saying that you'll have made the appropriate filing, and then is there a response that comes back? Do you need, or is it more like the HSR where there's a waiting period, but once the waiting period expires, assuming you haven't got a second request, or I guess equivalent in the UK would be calling it in or something where they want more, are you free to then close, assuming all the other closing conditions, or do you have to wait for some affirmative response from the authority saying you're free to go ahead and consummate the transaction?
You get an actual decision, so you'll get a clearance. I would say so it's not kind of wait and see. No news is good news, like under the HSR. I suppose the other difference is, I know HSR you sometimes get early termination. So I know there's often a hope, kind of, you say 30 business days, is there any chance of getting this in a week? In our experience, no. But you might get it a couple days earlier. I mean, to pick up, David, on what you were saying a minute ago about how sellers and buyers are sort of looking at transactions in this environment, I would say we're getting more questions when we act for buyers. We're getting questions from sellers in a way you might have previously, particularly in an auction situation, perhaps you might have often got questions: does your bid entail antitrust risk? If we go with you, are we going to have problems before the US authorities or before the CMA here? What conditionality are you willing to accept, etc. Now we are, as standard, getting FDI questions from sellers along with that. So even in transactions that I would struggle to see an FDI angle as to why there could be a national security issue, you will still get a seller or a seller's counsel saying to you, have you considered national security? Are you planning on making a filing? What do you see the risk as being? Because it's just right up there on the radar as something that you're expecting a well-considered buyer to have thought through.
Yeah, it's definitely, there are opportunities to have to get an edge on other buyers in an auction process to a certain extent. If you have an inkling of who might be wanting to buy the target, and those buyers come from countries that are currently not kind of in favor under the regimes, then you may be able to benefit from that as a buyer. That being said, they're quite, until you get into the review, the regimes are relatively buyer agnostic. They're more concerned about the target. They're very much target driven. So you may well have a very friendly state buyer, the United States or a European country, and the requirement to file is notified by everybody because of what the target is doing. And so you do have one interesting trend is that SPAs are now already coming sometimes with the conditionality built in. It's less of a fight. It's almost assumed. It's quite standard for the target council to have done an NSI filing already. So it sometimes becomes more of a confirmatory point. So, so you do sometimes get into gray area discussions where the rules, particularly in the UK and in others, are very detailed. They really have tried to balance them so that they catch what's concerning potentially, but don't restrict the economy too much. But there will be some, because they start getting into the finer details of certain products and so on, there can be a bit of a debate between the parties' counsel. And I think what really helps here is it goes back to getting prepared early. But one of the practical things is making sure that there's someone on the target side who is within the knowledge of the deal and the deal frame, and who really understands what the target does. Because the questions are unlike merger control, where we can quite easily rule out most filings just based on a breakdown of the turnover. And in FDI, it's going to come down to very detailed specifics of the target's activities in a particular country, which someone, who's basically on the shop floor would know. And so one of the practical tips often is make sure we have the right person at the target side to either rule something out very quickly or to get that filing done as quickly as we can, so that we can put that in. And it can often be done pre-signing, as long as you have a sort of definitive agreement or expectation of filing, of signing.
But I guess so many points to unpack there. But again, from the deal lawyer side, you want to have a smooth process really on both sides, and you want to avoid surprises. So to me, you almost have to do, especially in an auction context, a reverse. And this would apply even if you're a PE, private equity buyer or something, because I would think you want to start baking into the process some of the reverse diligence, so that as a seller, you're not just myopically focusing on the purchase price, which is great, but just as sellers will look at the things that you both have described on the merger control side or other regulatory fronts that they're familiar with, you don't want to get into a situation where you decide to go with a particular bidder only to discover later that they have some minority shareholder interests up the chain. And I assume these sort of do like on the merger control, where you just keep going up until you eventually hit a dead stop. You can't just look at the immediate parent company, for example. So you need to know who your buyer is. And it's actually a great question that it popped up right on this point, about what are sort of these red flags, and particularly from the target operation side, which the target really can't change, right, Gabby? That those are what you mentioned.
Yeah.
That is just what they do and where they do it. So that's one set, and I assume there are some obviously red flags in those mandatory industries or particularly sensitive ones. But then also, what about on the buyer ownership structure?
Yeah.
Do you need to do that reverse diligence and have a good feel early on as a seller? Who is this buyer and what is their ownership structure, and can that impact whether or not you get a deal through, or it takes much longer to get it through?
I'm happy to I have a go at this. I would say that yes, so the target it's a bit out of the target's control. I think some sectors will be more sensitive than others. They do try and pick up the key ones, but given I would say that right now anything to do with military and with certain kinds of technologies will be right up there on the radar, whereas others, they might not be that fussed about. And so it's really, how strategic is it today? And to your point, David, it's really getting a sense of the political landscape. taking a snapshot of the day. As to the buyer, I would say, to be honest, it's quite blunt often. The main risk is buyer nationality, because if you actually look at the stats, and we were looking at these before, there's a service that a lot of us use, basically a new service for competition lawyers called PAR, and they recently did a study of the estimated number of filings that were going through and deals that were blocked, and this landed in everyone's inbox. And it's interesting to see what countries are being most activist. And the top three in 2022 were the UK, Germany, and Canada. And if you look at the nationality of the buyer, practically in all cases, barring one or two, it was either a Chinese buyer, and in a minority of cases a European buyer, but would say Chinese, also with Russian links, so linked to maybe oligarchs or something like that. So I would say, just speaking bluntly, the number one risk factor is buyer nationality.
But what does that mean, Gabby? Let me make sure I understand that. So you could have an entity that, let's say, is French or U.S. or something. But when you say, the buyer, I assume you're talking about the ultimate. So what
Yes.
if you had, for example, a Chinese that owns a minority interest in a French company or some other company, that I assume would fall into China?
Yes. So that's
Okay.
a very good question. Jen, do you want to take this? This
Yeah,
is something
sure.
that comes up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to come back to what you were saying before, David, sort of how much disclosure do you have to give? I guess it all ties together. Yes, you can't just say this is the immediate acquiring entity, or it's incorporated in France. France is, France good, therefore we're done here. There's, it's a short filing that you make in the UK, for instance, but it is extremely focused on giving transparency about the acquirer ownership structure. It's basically acquirer ownership structure and target activities. That's what you're explaining in your filing, and you're expected to go, all the way up the chain and to cover, stakes of maybe as small as 5%. So in terms of what you were saying, David, about being buyers maybe thinking in advance and so on, I think some private equity houses are starting to rethink, perhaps this is something we should be taking into account next time we're going out for funding. Should we be, especially if we've got a situation where we've got sort of 95% perceived Western investors, and then we might have a 5% stake from sort of less clear jurisdiction. Well, that could really affect our deal risk, for everyone. And so maybe we want to have a clearer line. And the other thing I would say is that so far what we've seen, there's very little deference given to, this isn't a state-owned entity. There's no kind of, it's a Chinese entity, but it's not state-owned. I don't think there's much trust in that as a concept by the Western governments. They tend to think, rightly or wrongly, that the Chinese government can probably interfere in most, if not all, Chinese entities, regardless of whether they're ostensibly state-owned or not.
I mean, I think the real contrast here from merger control and the other regulatory regimes that we've been used to is that it's so political. It's really up to the government to decide. There is no interaction. There's very little dialogue. There's nothing you can put in to change their minds. You put in a filing, and then even in the big ones that are controversial, it's very unlikely that there'll be any discussion until there's a decision that arrives in the inbox of the legal representative and the parties. So I think it's recognizing that there's this sort of very 100% political dimension here. There are, I guess, a left field risk might be really the flavor of the day. Is there scope for potential of scope creep? So you would hope that really these regimes are not misused, and they really are focused on protecting vital interests. But there have been examples of deals that have been blocked, and because you don't get reasons, there's all speculation. But the speculation in the press will be it's to protect local jobs, or it's because someone was putting pressure on us. There was a really interesting one where in the UK there was recently blocked a couple of months back, that sort of dragged on. They pretty much cleared it, and there was a lot of shouting in Parliament about why it was a semiconductor deal, and why was a Chinese investor allowed to, via a Dutch one, allowed to purchase this company, and the government at the time said that they weren't that concerned, and then all of a sudden there was sort of retrospective investigation, and it was blocked. And so it was quite a surprise. But then when you start kind of reading more into it, it looks like there was some communication from the US government, putting a bit of pressure on the UK government to look at the transaction. So you do have a sense that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes in terms of allied government interactions and pressures. And I would say, the question I think we get a lot is the deal with the Chinese investor or investor in the chain off the table? I would say it depends on the country. I don't think it's necessarily off the table in a lot, and possibly not in the UK. I think it will depend on the sector. I get the sense from speaking to some of our friendly law firms in other countries that we work with on these, that it's a no-go in some countries. I know that Canada has been very resistant. Almost a different policy question, which is, but there's so much of our critical mineral assets already owned by the Chinese. Can we afford to give up more? So it's quite a different question, and because it's driven by their experience of what their political context and background is.
Is this is this a remedies? I know there's a lot of differences, right? Jen, I know we've talked about that in the U.S. approach versus, let's say, the U.K. My recollection was, in the U.S. we're all about remedies, and there's different ways to do it. I've heard that the U.S. might be shifting a bit, and less enamored with kind of remedies, divestitures, getting rid of some overlaps, things like that, and moving more toward, maybe you've seen that in some of the tech actions that the U.S. government's been taking in the antitrust area, of just blocking, more blocking. On the FDI side, and I guess merger control, I'm curious, is it still is it still more focused on, less focused on remedies? And in the FDI area, Gabby, the way you described it, it doesn't sound like, there's not a process for communication. So you're not remedying anything. You're just getting a notification saying, sorry, not approved. And then I guess your deal, dies. There might be a termination fee or reverse termination fee or something like that might be payable, by the buyer to the seller if that was negotiated. But are there ways to think about remedies in advance? Like, for example, could you, in a deal where there's questions about losing jobs or taking the technology overseas, make commitments in advance, in public, let's say, so that the people who are reviewing this can sort of see that you're going to maintain the operations in the UK, or not close facilities for periods of time or something like that. Anyway, that's a few thoughts, but like, how do you think about those issues in terms of overlapping with remedies, or maybe thinking about ways to structure the deal so that you can anticipate potential problems and maybe, give them some comfort, even though it's not in the formal process?
Yeah, and we often see potential remedies being part of a deal negotiation. So thinking in the pure sort of merger control context, there might be a discussion of sort of what capacity, maybe what manufacture, up to this amount of manufacturing capacity we're willing to divest, or these facilities or these locations or this portion of the business, and you might stipulate in your SPA it's up to that amount. We will offer it, and we'll offer it at this point in the process. Because often in the UK and European regimes, there is an opportunity to offer remedies at the end of phase one, and to get to avoid a much longer phase two by doing that. And in UK and Europe, by the time you're done with your pre-notification and then you've done a phase one review, that's already quite a long period. And a lot of parties are unwilling to have their deal uncertain for an even longer phase two period. So often the negotiations are, what are we willing to offer at the end of, if it is going the wrong way, what are we willing to offer at the end of phase one? to sort this out, and who has discretion. You know, normally it's the buyer will have ultimate discretion, but you might put some wording about it as to, you know, because it is an offer that has to come proactively from the parties at phase one in a merger control context. So yeah, and now we're starting to see that expanded to the FDI side. And I mean, it's tempting to draw conclusions from some of the initial statistics about the extent to which there are outright prohibitions, and you know, but maybe there's been a lot of focus on those, but there are some behavioural remedies too, and I think probably our authorities on the FDI side are still learning as well from the CFIUS regime, amongst others. So you do see some sort of information barriers and so on, restricted site access. I think we'll, if anything, in the FDI side, see more progress and willingness to accept behavioural. I wouldn't say there's zero chance as well to influence the remedy on the FDI side, but you know, we're only 13 months in, as Gabby said, for the UK regime, for instance. But you know, our experience and what we're hearing from other practitioners is that it is, you know, particularly with something like what behavioural remedy would work, there's an opportunity to engage with parties and parties counsel there, I would say, to the government, and to get the remedy right. And I think there's definitely room for more engagement of what we've seen of the UK government's process and other governments' processes so far. I don't know if you want to add anything, Gabby, on the FDI side.
No, I think that it's still early days. I think sometimes it's hard to envisage how a divestment might work, but you know, it's not the law allows for other forms of remedies, and let's not forget that in a merger context where there are remedies required, they're typically not, you know, that they're much more common than a deal being blocked. So you could envisage a situation quite conceively of maybe a division in a business being divested. That's the more problematic one, so that there isn't uncomfortable ownership of that division. It will be interesting to see, because query whether the deals that have really received the most attention have been the ones that it's been very narrow. It's not. They've been very specific about trying to block deals that raise the most concerns. So query if there's scope for part ownership being allowed. But I think that I agree with Jen that FDI is a perfect example where behavioral remedies would fit quite well, which they tend to not like in a merger control context.
Well, it's this has been an extremely fascinating discussion. I guess who would have thought that an hour could go by so quickly talking about, you know, merger control and FDI, but at least for me, it was really informative, and I'm super happy that, you know, Jen, you willing to jump in at the last minute with zero preparation. So you did fantastic, and so many good information. So for people listening, if you want to, and a lot of people I've noticed watch these later because it stays up on our feeds. And so, you know, I'm sure people may, you know, like or comment or send things in after when they get a chance to watch it, especially over your time where it's a little bit later. So if people have other questions, or there are other things that we did not cover, maybe we can always do a part 2, but let us know and we're happy to do it. But before we head off, I think both of you are doing interesting stuff in sort of the branding area. And Gabby, we talked about that a while back when we had a little side conversation, but maybe you could just mention some of the things that you're doing in that area, which I just think is really cool. And I think we're one of the only, you know, I guess global law firms that really are focused on that. So if you want to, you know, get a plug on that, or talk about what you both are doing in that area, that'd be great.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah. So we do national security, and we also do brands, luxury. And I mentioned this to someone the other day, and they said, sounds like I'm operating at the intersection of like James Bond's idea of the law.
Right.
But yeah, we, as competition lawyers, we basically cover everything that deals with how a company is engaging with the market. So when people often stare at me blankly when I say I'm an antitrust or a competition lawyer, because they have no idea what that is. But when you start to explain it, they realize it's all around us. So our niche here in our European team, and we do it extensively in the States, I would say we're probably one one of the largest firms really focusing on this in the world, is to design distribution strategies, go-to-market strategies for consumer brands across a range of sectors. So that's when we're wearing our other hat.
Well, it's great. Yeah, Jen, you're working on the same things, and give us your thoughts on it too.
If brands are having trouble with, oh, do we want to be on that marketplace, or we like that marketplace, but that one's a bit more lowbrow, then that's the kind of thing we can help them with, or map minimum advertised pricing policies in the US, or brand equity, I would say. And Gabby and I also work there. Thank you, David.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. When I hadn't really paid attention to that, but when Gabby and I were talking about it, it's really an interesting, very cool practice area, one, and being just in branding and more of a consumer facing thing is interesting for for us who tend to do more sort of business deal type work. So I think that's great. Yeah, we could do another one on maybe even on that at some point. That's a really interesting area. But I think we're out of time. I appreciate both of you. I think it's incredible information. Hopefully people found it useful. And again, we could always do even a deeper dive on some of these other topics in the future. So Gabby, thank you for agreeing to do it. Jen, thank you so much for jumping in at the last minute, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it. And we will, I think I'm going to do my next one February 21. So an announcement will come out on that in the next few days. So thanks, Gabby. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Great to be with you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.